Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Q-Man channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Blade 2 from 2002. The Shadow World, a realm where the nocturnal hunt is not merely a metaphor but a stark reality, calls back its most infamous operative. Wesley Snipes, embodying Blade, the half-human, half-vampire hybrid. Having spent time honing his skills against the blood-sucking menace across various dimly lit corners of the globe, a tireless vigil inherited from his mother's tragic encounter with a vampire's bite, Blade finds himself reluctantly drawn back into the fray. This time, the threat is not the usual rabble of the undead, but something far more alarming, a plague threatening even the established hierarchy of the vampire nation. The Council of Elders, those ancient, usually complacent bloodsuckers, who prefer their existence discreetly hidden in opulent subterranean lairs, summon him. They recognize a superior existential danger when they see one. The threat is a new breed of vampire, mutated and hyper-aggressive, dubbed the Reapers. Unlike their ancestors who operated under certain gentlemanly rules, avoiding wholesale slaughter to maintain secrecy, the Reapers are ravenous, fast, and seemingly unstoppable, devouring humans and vampires alike with terrifying efficiency. This new strain possesses a vulnerability Blade's usual arsenal might not easily counter, and its very existence threatens to expose the vampire's secret to the wider, unsuspecting human world, a catastrophic outcome for the species as a whole. Blade, ever the solitary warrior whose commitment to extermination stems from personal tragedy rather than any sense of duty to the Council, agrees to cooperate, but on his own uncompromising terms. He is pragmatic. If the Reapers wipe out the vampires, they might just turn their attention to him next, or worse, to the human world he secretly protects. He brings his signature arsenal, the UV weaponry, the customized bikes, and the quiet, intimidating efficiency that has made him a legend in the underground circuits. His investigation leads him to Prague, a city steeped in ancient European Gothicism, the perfect backdrop for this escalating war. He needs assistance, and surprisingly, the Council provides it, though not without suspicion. Enter Nisa Damaskinos, played with a subtle, regal air, the daughter of Eli Damaskinos, the apparent progenitor of the current vampire society. She is intelligent, resourceful, and perhaps harbors a flicker of genuine desire to save her species, rather than just cling to outdated power structures. There is also a team of elite vampire assassins, the Shadow Squad, assigned to work alongside Blade, an arrangement fraught with mutual distrust. The core of the problem soon becomes apparent. The Reapers were engineered, accidentally or intentionally, in the labs of Eli Damaskinos himself, an attempt to breed a superior vampire free from the usual weaknesses. But science, like unchecked ambition, often breeds monstrosities. The lead Reaper, Quinn, is revealed to be one of Damaskinos' former creations, now turned leader of the new breed, embodying a brutal evolution of vampire physiology. Blade's methods clash violently with the Council's desire for subtlety. His raids are spectacular and destructive, demonstrating his utter lack of concern for collateral damage, human or vampire. As the investigation deepens, a personal connection to the conspiracy emerges. Blade encounters Scud, Damaskinos' seemingly meek lab assistant, who turns out to be deeply involved in the genetic tampering, driven by a perverse desire for recognition and perhaps a touch of envy for Blade's unique hybrid strength. The final confrontation takes place in Damaskinos' sprawling, heavily fortified headquarters. It becomes a chaotic three-way battle. Blade, attempting to eradicate the Reapers and expose the Council's complicity, the Reapers, hungry for blood and dominance, and the remaining Council forces fighting a desperate rearguard action. Nisa proves her worth, fighting alongside Blade with skill honed by generations of vampire privilege, recognizing that true survival means adaptation, not stagnation. In the climax, Blade faces off against Quinn, the monstrous Reaper leader. The fight is visceral, testing Blade's limits. The Reaper's speed and sheer power are overwhelming. Yet Blade's unique heritage, his relentless training, and his sheer willpower see him through. He eliminates the primary threat, ultimately confronting Damaskinos himself, exposing the arrogance that bred this disaster. Nisa, surviving the carnage, shows a newfound respect, perhaps even affection, for the vampire hunter, acknowledging the necessity of his brutal crusade. As dawn breaks over the bloodied halls, the immediate danger is neutralized. Blade, ever the phantom, slips away, leaving Nissa and the few survivors to deal with the wreckage. His mission is never truly complete. The shadows merely shift, and a tireless hunter must remain ever vigilant for the next iteration of darkness, a destiny sealed long before his birth. The atmosphere in Prague was thick, not just with the ancient chill of Eastern European stone, but with the palpable tension of an impending apocalypse filtered through Gothic architecture. Blade moved through it like a phantom forged in chrome and vengeance, his movements economical, betraying years spent perfecting the art of the silent kill. Snipes's portrayal always suggested a man perpetually running on low fuel, fueled only by pure, unadulterated rage against the night dwellers. He carried the weight of his existence, the constant proximity to the darkness he fought, in the hard set of his jaw and the way his trench coat seemed to absorb all available light. Nisa Damaskinos, conversely, exuded a practiced grace. She was a creature of privilege, who nonetheless possessed a keen, predatory intellect. Watching her interact with Blade was fascinating. She possessed the arrogance of someone accustomed to giving orders, yet she recognized in him a force of nature she couldn't command, only perhaps momentarily align with. Her initial interactions with him were laced with condescension, viewing his human-derived grit with suspicion, contrasting it sharply with the inherited immortality of her kind. Her lineage, descending from Damaskinos, meant she was deeply embedded in the culture of secrecy, a culture the Reapers were shattering with their reckless consumption. The introduction of the Shadow Squad was a masterstroke of dramatic irony. These elite vampires, honed by centuries of carefully managed violence, were tasked with protecting the hunter they secretly despised. Their leader, Whistler's stand-in perhaps in spirit if not in presence, treated Blade with barely concealed contempt. They saw his methods as messy, too overtly violent, a danger to the delicate veneer of their civilization. They adhered to the old rules, rules that were now proving utterly insufficient against an enemy unbound by tradition. The deeper Blade delved into the engineering behind the Reapers, the more disgusted he became. Damaskinos, the patriarch, was revealed not just as an ancient vampire, but as a hubristic scientist, a veritable Dr. Frankenstein of the undead. The creation of the Reapers, dubbed the Death Dealers in some circles, was an attempt to transcend mortality's petty limitations, to create the ultimate predator. This reflected a common trope in cinematic villains, the pursuit of perfect evolution leading directly to catastrophic downfall. Damaskinos' laboratory, when finally explored, wasn't just a torture chamber. It was a gleaming, high-tech monument to ego, contrasting sharply with Blade's analog, brute force approach. Scud, the seemingly harmless tech liaison, provided the human element of betrayal. His transformation from nervous underling to active participant in the Reaper genesis was subtly foreshadowed by his obsessive tinkering, his hunger for recognition overshadowing any inherent loyalty to the established hierarchy. He represented the dangerous allure of power, even if channeled through grotesque experimentation. The final battle was less about tactics and more about raw survival against overwhelming biological superiority. Quinn, the lead Reaper, was depicted as a terrifying physical specimen, muscles coiled, jaws elongated beyond human recognition, moving with a speed that defied physics. Ow. When Blade and Quinn clashed, it wasn't a duel of wits. It was a visceral slugfest where Blade had to rely on his unique physiology, the half-human resilience combined with vampire strength, to absorb punishment that would instantly kill any pureblood. The environment itself became weaponized. UV flares exploded in blinding sheets, turning the Baroque halls into abstract expressionist canvases of fire and shadow. Nissa, fighting side by side with the human-sided half-breed, finally shed the last vestiges of her aristocratic detachment, fighting with a desperate ferocity born of realizing her entire world was minutes from being devoured. When Blade finally dispatched Quinn, plunging a custom-made blade deep into his exposed heart, or whatever passed for it, it was less a victory celebration and more a temporary lull in an unending war. The escape into the pale morning light reaffirmed Blade's isolation. He could save the world, but he could never truly belong to it, or to the night he hunted. He remained the necessary aberration. Blade's perpetual state of weary alertness was almost a physical manifestation of his burden. His eyes, perpetually shadowed beneath the brim of his sunglasses even indoors, missed nothing. It was this hypervigilance, honed by years of solitary dedication, a commitment mirroring the tireless dedication of a highly specialized Black Ops agent, except his targets never slept, that allowed him to navigate the labyrinthine politics of the vampire elite with grudging success. He didn't care for their ancient grudges or their decadent rituals. He cared only for the elimination of the threat. His armor wasn't just Kevlar and leather. It was a psychological shell protecting the fragile humanity he desperately tried to keep separate from the vampiric urges stirring beneath his skin. Nissa, as she spent more time in the field under the pressure cooker of the Reaper attacks, began to shed the veneer of the pampered princess. Her initial disdain for Blade's brute force evolved into a grudging acknowledgement of its necessity. There was a moment, perhaps during a desperate retreat through Prague's cobblestone alleys, where she saw Blade take down 3 Reapers single-handedly, absorbing blows that would have shattered a normal vampire, and something shifted. She realized that while her lineage offered longevity, Blade possessed something rarer, adaptability forged by pain. Her inherent regal bearing started to mix with the fierce grit of a survivor, a subtle transformation that suggested she might actually live to see the next sunrise by her own choices, not just by her father's decree. The Shadow Squad, those impeccably dressed assassins, were fascinatingly brittle under pressure. Their centuries of training were predicated on fighting enemies they could see and understand. Lesser vampires, rogue humans. Against the bioengineered savagery of the Reapers, their discipline fractured. They moved with the rigid formality of an old military unit facing an alien invasion. Their precision dissolved into panicked self-preservation. Their inevitable deaths were sudden and brutally messy, serving as a stark visual lesson to Nissa and the audience. Tradition offered no protection against innovation in evil. Eli Damaskinos, when finally confronted, wasn't just an antagonist. He was the embodiment of failed aspiration. He spoke with the smooth, cultured tones of a man who believed his intellectual superiority justified any atrocity. His chambers, filled with preserved ancient texts, alongside bleeding-edge genetic sequencing equipment, illustrated his core hubris, the belief that he could control evolution itself. His creation of the Reapers was his attempt to cheat his own species' slow decay, an act of pure, narcissistic paternalism towards a monster he couldn't contain. When Blade finally cornered him, Damaskinos displayed not fear, but irritation, the annoyance of a great artist whose masterpiece has turned against him. Scud's final moments, captured in the chaos of the fortress, were less about redemption and more about tragic realization. When his role in the Reaper outbreak was fully revealed, his slight frame shuddered not with defiance, but with the pathetic terror of a small man who reached too high. He had craved the power embodied by Blade, the power of evolution, and ended up merely being fertilizer for the apex predator he helped unleash. The physical toll on Blade during the final engagement with Quinn was immense. It wasn't just about landing the killing blow, it was about enduring the unrelenting assault of the Reaper's enhanced physiology, Their sheer physical density and speed were superior to the standard vampire stock. Blade fought with a savage grace, his every strike precise, driven by the memory of the humans and the few allies he'd lost along the way. He moved with the efficiency of a master martial artist, every parry and riposte calculated not for flair, but for immediate termination. When he finally stood over the remnants of the death dealers, the brief silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the heavy, expectant quiet before the next necessary storm. He collected his weapons, the metal cool against his gloved hands, and vanished back into the urban sprawl, the city merely a temporary host before the shadows called him onward. The aftermath of the Damaskinos debacle left a strange vacuum in the vampire underworld. The council, decimated and exposed, retreated further into the hidden recesses of global power, licking their wounds and attempting to manage the narrative damage caused by the Reaper incident. Blade, having averted a world-ending catastrophe, a fact the mainstream populace remained blissfully unaware of, resumed his solitary patrol, finding a perverse comfort in the familiar routine of the hunt. He wasn't seeking accolades, he was seeking silence, a temporary respite earned through bloodshed. His focus invariably drifted to the fragmented remnants of the Damaskinos organization, particularly Nisa. Nisa Damaskinos, now arguably the most powerful surviving vampire of the old guard, found herself in an unenviable position. Her father's ambition had nearly erased her kind, and the old structures of control were proving too fragile to maintain. She carried the memory of fighting alongside Blade, not as a scar, but as a strange, unsettling blueprint for survival. She had witnessed true, selfless commitment to a cause, albeit one antithetical to her own nature. Unlike the cautious vampires who wanted to rebuild the old facade, Nisa, influenced by her brief exposure to Blade's uncompromising reality, began to entertain dangerous thoughts. Perhaps the system itself was the weakness. Her inheritance was not just wealth and territory, but the heavy burden of reformation. She started subtly making moves, not to erase Blade, but to understand the mechanics of his existence, the bridge between human tenacity and vampiric power that he represented. She retained a fragment of Blade's captured technology, perhaps a sliver of UV filament, or a discarded piece of specialized ammunition, studying it with the meticulous focus of a scientist, driven by the chilling realization that the next plague might not come from a lab, but from something even less predictable. The human resistance waking up. Blade, meanwhile, was drawn to a new pattern of disappearances in Eastern Europe, disturbingly similar to the early warning signs before the Reaper outbreak, yet subtly different. There were no signs of the hypermutation, but the targets were specific. Individuals with rare genetic markers, people whose biological makeup might hold the key to combating, or conversely enhancing, the vampire condition. This suggested a new player, one operating with Damaskinos' ambition, but perhaps possessing more discretion, or perhaps someone who had learned the hard lesson about engineering unstoppable monstrosities. The quiet desperation in these disappearances resonated with Blade's own origin story, the haunting echo of his mother's fate. He knew this hunt wouldn't involve sterile labs and arrogant patriarchs. This felt older, more instinctual, rooted in the deep, dark lore that predated even the Council of Elders. He checked his supplies, the familiar weight of his specialized arsenal reassuring, knowing that whatever emerged next, it would require more than just UV light. It would require an understanding of the very essence of his hybrid being. The shadows were indeed shifting, and the Eternal Sentinel tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, ready to step back into the cold embrace of the eternal night war. The transition from the high-tech, bioengineered terror of the Reapers to this new, more clandestine threat felt like stepping from a brightly lit industrial complex back into the damp, forgotten crypts of history. Blade sensed the difference immediately. Where the Reapers were a loud, biological statement, this new wave of disappearances felt insidious, like a slow poison seeping into the foundations of the human world that the vampires secretly preyed upon. He moved with increased caution through the sprawling, rain-slicked cities bordering the Carpathian Mountains. His movements now incorporated more evasive maneuvers, less reliance on overwhelming firepower, a tactical shift born from the realization that brute force had nearly been his undoing against Quinn. He was becoming more introspective, the brief partnership with Nysa having cracked the shell of his isolation, just enough for lingering doubt to creep in. The unsettling thought that coexistence, however temporary, was possible. Nysa, far from the suffocating grandeur of her father's lair, immersed herself in the minutiae of the surviving vampire infrastructure. She understood that power wasn't just about bloodlines, it was about information control. She had access to the fragments of Damaskinos' research notes, meticulously studying the biological anomalies that Blade was now tracking. Her desperation wasn't purely for survival. It was the intellectual challenge of preventing history from repeating itself, this time on her watch. She began to operate with a chilling pragmatism, making alliances with minor vampire factions who favored radical change over stubborn adherence to tradition. Her eyes held a new fire, the look of a monarch who has seen the guillotine up close and decided to preemptively reform the system before the masses revolted. She wasn't trying to become Blade, but she was attempting to distill his effectiveness, the ruthless focus, into the vampire governance, creating a more adaptable, resilient species, one that could perhaps even anticipate Blade's next move, should their uneasy truce falter. Blade's inquiries led him down paths frequented by occult historians and marginalized geneticists, individuals who understood the boundary where science merged with ancient myth. He found an aging academic in Budapest, a man whose reputation bordered on the lunatic fringe, who spoke of primordial vampiric strains, creatures less evolved than the Damaskinos stock, perhaps immune to UV light due to their primitive biological makeup. This research pointed towards hidden vampire covens, who deliberately eschewed modernization, living in deep communion with primal rituals, perhaps even possessing the means to create a plague that bypassed the chemical warfare Blade typically employed. The emotional landscape of the hunt grew more complex. Blade carried the spectral weight of those he couldn't save, the faces of the innocent casualties from the Prague conflict flickering in moments of near exhaustion. He had saved the vampires, yes, but he had done it for humanity's sake, a distinction he never let himself forget. This new path, focusing on genetic purity rather than engineered mutation, felt like a return to the core philosophical struggle, the nature of the vampire itself. He knew that confronting these older lineages would test his own duality. Would the human part of him instinctively recognize the danger, or would the inherited vampiric attributes offer a dangerous form of comprehension, a brief moment of understanding with the enemy that could prove fatal? The air felt heavier, charged with the anticipation of encountering adversaries who fought not with science, but with dogma and the cold, unyielding power of unbroken tradition. He was no longer just hunting monsters, he was hunting the very origins of the darkness that claimed his mother. The academic in Budapest, a man whose study looked more like a curated museum of forbidden texts than a place of legitimate learning, provided Blade with the first concrete lead: Whispers of the Blood Rite, a secret gathering held only when the established vampire hierarchy faced existential threat or was deemed too compromised by modernity. This rite, purportedly hosted by the true untainted remnants of the ancient bloodlines, the ones who viewed Damaskinos and the Council as frivolous upstarts, was rumored to be the crucible for new evolutionary mandates. Blade interpreted this as a breeding ground for the next major threat, likely a synthesis of primal aggression and ancient lore, bypassing the weaknesses of both the purebloods and the Reapers. His pursuit of the rite led him deep into the Balkan interior, a landscape where civilization seemed to erode the further one traveled from major centers. The setting itself seemed to resist him. The technology that usually provided him an edge, Signal jammers, GPS tracking, faltered in the dense magnetic atmosphere of the region. He was forced back onto cruder methods, tracking obscure folklore, bribing local figures who dealt in dark secrets, and relying almost entirely on his enhanced senses. This dependence on instinct rather than instrumentation emphasized his heritage. He was becoming less the cybernetically enhanced vampire hunter and more the primal avenger his mother's fate demanded. Meanwhile, Nyssa was navigating the treacherous waters of vampire politics with the cunning of a viper, recognizing a necessary shift in the ecosystem. She used the remnants of the Council's intelligence network to monitor Blade's movements, not to betray him, but to anticipate the nature of the enemy he was tracking. She saw the pattern. The Reapers were a failed experiment in hubris. This new threat, the Blood Rite, represented a reactionary purge, a return to fundamentalism that might ironically be more dangerous precisely because it was less predictable by science. Nyssa realized that if Blade successfully rooted out these primal vampires, it would destabilize the delicate balance she was trying to establish, potentially leading to outright chaos in the dark world. She began to strategically leak minor, misleading intelligence to Blade, nudging him slightly off course, trying to force him to confront smaller, localized threats first, buying time for her to consolidate power among the more moderate survivors. The tension between their goals mounted. Blade saw Nyssa's actions as subterfuge, a typical vampire ploy to maintain control, fueling his inherent distrust. When he intercepted a coded message meant for a minor European blood baron, confirming Nyssa's manipulation, his resolve hardened. The fragile thread of their pragmatic alliance snapped. He recognized the eternal truth: vampires, regardless of their sophistication, would always prioritize self-preservation and deception over transparency. The climax of this phase occurred in an ancient, abandoned monastery carved into a sheer mountainside. Blade infiltrated the suspected location of the rite, expecting an organized coven. Instead, he found a horrifying tableau. A group of local humans, genetically desirable specimens, being prepared for ritual sacrifice, their blood being mixed with ancient, unknown catalysts. This was not about evolution. It was about purification through primal infusion. The attackers were fierce, lean, and moved with a swiftness that spoke of rigorous physical conditioning rather than mere vampiric speed. They were not the genetically perfect predators of Damaskinos. They were fanatics driven by dogma. Blade engaged them in a brutal fight that spanned the crumbling cloisters, the clang of his silvered blades against their antique weaponry echoing through the valleys. He wasn't just fighting vampires. He was fighting an ideology determined to strip away all complexity, reducing existence to the purity of the hunt. A terrifyingly simple goal that demanded absolute eradication of anything deemed impure, including the hybrid that walked among them. The atmosphere within the ruined monastery was thick with the smell of old stone, dried blood, and the acrid scent of ozone from Blade's overloaded UV weaponry. These antagonists, the self-proclaimed purists of the Blood Rite, fought with a terrifying focus that stemmed from unshakable conviction. They were lean, almost ascetic in their appearance, lacking the decadent bulk of the Council vampires, yet their attacks were surgical and relentless. Their leader, a figure draped in tattered, ancient vestments, moved with a fluid grace that spoke of generations of unimpeded natural evolution, uncorrupted by science or compromise. He challenged Blade not with taunts about his humanity, but with quiet scorn for his reliance on modern tools, viewing Blade as a mongrel tainted by both sides. Blade's response to this doctrinal warfare was pure, kinetic fury. The close-quarters combat forced him into an unnerving intimacy with his enemy. He noticed a key distinction. These purebloods didn't seem to possess the same immediate regeneration as the modern vampires. They were physically superior in speed and resilience, but perhaps vulnerable to massive traumatic injury, a weakness Blade was happy to exploit. Each swing of his custom sword felt less like a professional execution and more like a deeply personal purge, an act of spiritual cleansing against those who clung to a corrupted version of the knight's dominion. He fought with the cold, analytical precision that had made him a legend in the surveillance files of every intelligence agency, human and undead, but underpinned by a simmering resentment for the self-righteousness of his foes. The captured humans, pale and terrified, represented the line Blade refused to let them cross. Witnessing their intended fate, to be ritually consumed to purify the ancient bloodline, ignited a familiar, protective rage. This was the core of his purpose, preserving the messy, flawed humanity that the vampires, in all their iterations, sought to dominate or erase. He managed to cut a path toward the altar where the ritual was being prepared, neutralizing the immediate threat to the captives with a spectacular deployment of silver nitrate darts, momentarily blinding the core group of acolytes. Nisa's interference, while subtle, had achieved its aim. Blade had expended significant resources and energy on this localized threat. When he finally stood victorious over the scattered remains of the right acolytes, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. He activated a secure comm unit, intending to sever contact with Nisa permanently, only to find her already establishing a secure channel. Her voice, usually measured, carried an edge of genuine alarm. "You've disrupted something older, Blade." They were moving towards a grand unification, a blending of the old ways and the failures of my father. "Your zealotry has created a strategic vacuum." Nisa wasn't apologizing for her manipulation, she was stating a new strategic reality. She informed him that the disappearance of the genetically marked individuals wasn't about ritual sacrifice, it was about leveraging their specific DNA against known vampire weaknesses, a countermeasures effort spearheaded by a consortium of surviving frightened council members who decided the only way forward was to engineer a counteragent, a human cure, weaponized by vampire knowledge. This revelation struck Blade harder than any physical blow. The enemy was no longer just the vampire. It was the desperate, misguided attempt by his enemies to create a weapon against themselves, using human biology as the raw material. This meant the targets were likely being held captive in a secure, technologically advanced facility, shielded by the very council members who had previously seemed weak. The hunt shifted instantly, from dusty crypts back to the cold, sterile world of clandestine science, suggesting that the pragmatic survivors were now even more dangerous than the zealots. Blade felt a deep, weary resignation. The fight was cyclical. Kill one threat, and another, often more complex and scientifically insidious, would rise from the ashes. He knew he needed to find Nissa again, not as an ally, but as a reluctant source of information. For only one with insider knowledge could penetrate the new stronghold of the fear-driven council. He turned his back on the crumbling monastery, the next phase of the war already coded in the faint electronic signature Nissa had transmitted. The shift in objective, from eradicating spiritual fundamentalists to infiltrating a paranoid, technologically equipped council stronghold, was jarring, forcing Blade to recalibrate his entire operational tempo. He understood the council's desperate calculus. Having witnessed the evolutionary dead end of the Reapers, they reverted to the only defense mechanism they truly trusted: secrecy and advanced human counter-technology, ironically weaponized using the very nature they sought to control. The idea that they were harvesting viable human DNA to synthesize a cure was an abhorrent twist. They sought to weaponize purity against their own corruption. Blade made the necessary, pragmatic choice to re-engage with Nisa. Their renewed communication was terse, conducted through heavily scrambled, disposable channels that bypassed traditional surveillance. Nisa operated from the shadows of the remaining organized vampire society, maintaining a facade of quiet deference to the remaining elders, while secretly undermining their efforts to initiate this desperate, countermeasure project. She viewed the project as a suicide pact, synthesizing a universal cure, even if flawed, risked exposure that would bring down the entirety of the hidden world. For Nisa, Survival meant controlled evolution, not self-immolation via panic-driven science. "They are hidden beneath the former seat of the council in Geneva," Nisa transmitted, her voice devoid of its earlier aristocratic flourish, replaced by the clipped urgency of a field commander. "It's a deep bunker, designed to withstand everything short of tactical nuclear strikes. They are using advanced human genetics experts they've coerced or controlled for centuries. They call the project Ascension Protocol." Blade absorbed the coordinates, the familiar coldness settling back over him. Geneva, the heart of human neutrality and international diplomacy, was the perfect camouflage for the undead's final desperate gambit. His return to high-tech infiltration meant retrieving his specialized gear from various preset caches across Europe, requiring him to move faster and more covertly than ever before. He needed to be in and out before the council realized that Nisa, their reluctant lieutenant, had betrayed their deepest secret to the one being they most feared. The emotional weight on Blade was heavy, but familiar. Each mission stripped away another layer of his carefully maintained detachment. He felt a strange kinship with Nisa's dilemma. Both were aberrations fighting against a system determined to cling to outdated paradigms. She was fighting to save the species by adapting. He was fighting to save humanity by destroying the threat. Their goals occasionally aligned, but their inherent natures guaranteed conflict. As Blade prepared his customized transport, a heavily modified vehicle built for speed and near-silent infiltration, a necessary evolution from his motorcycle for sustained cross-continental travel, he reflected on the hollowness of victory. Even if he neutralized the Ascension Protocol, the Council would simply reorganize, or another genetic splinter group would emerge. He was the ultimate check and balance in a war no human knew was being fought. He paused only long enough to ensure his specialized UV plasma charges were at maximum output. If the Council had built an impenetrable fortress based on human science, he would answer with vampire hunting technology pushed to its absolute, self-destructive limit. The hunt for the Council's hidden lab became a desperate race against time, a final confrontation where the fate of both species rested on the shoulders of the hybrid who belonged to neither. The infiltration of the Geneva facility was a masterclass in blending the supernatural with the surgically precise application of espionage craft. Blade approached the massive subterranean entrance not with explosives, but with cloaking technology borrowed from his brief, uneasy dalliances with shadowy human intelligence operatives, echoes of the necessary evils he encountered while hunting rogue vampires in the shadows of London and New York. The entrance, disguised beneath a mundane corporate facade, was protected by layers of biometric scanners and conventional security systems that Blade dismissed with contemptuous ease, slicing through their digital defenses like a razor through silk. His reliance on highly specialized gear here felt less like an advantage and more like a necessity against an enemy who had begun studying his own methods. Inside, the facility was a sterile nightmare, a stark contrast to the Gothic decay of Prague. White walls, humming servers, and pressurized containment units dominated the landscape. This was not a lair of aristocratic vampires. This was a panic room built by terrified scientists who understood mortality too well. The coercion of the human geneticists was evident in the quality of the work. They were applying cutting-edge virology and cellular biology to combat the undead curse, but their desperation had made them ethically bankrupt. Blade moved through the corridors, his footsteps muffled by the specialized soles of his boots, his internal clock ticking down the moments until Nissa's compromised intelligence would run out and the Council elders would realize the breach. He located the central laboratory where the Ascension Protocol was being tested. Rows of cryogenic tubes held the carefully harvested human subjects, their genetic material being processed. The air crackled with electromagnetic energy from the sequencing machinery. Standing guard were not the standard hulking bodyguards of the elders, but genetically enhanced vampire shock troops, an attempt to create a controlled reaper immune to UV. a concept that sickened Blade with its inherent arrogance. These guards were faster, more durable than standard purebloods, representing the Council's ultimate fearful evolution. The ensuing confrontation was characterized by intense, contained violence. Blade couldn't afford massive detonations here. The goal was neutralization and extraction, not demolition. He engaged the shock troops in close combat, employing environmental tactics, shattering the containment units to release bursts of super-chilled inert gas, using the blinding emergency lighting sequences as cover. He moved with the ruthless efficiency of a highly trained Special Forces operative, relying on speed and knowledge of anatomical weak points, a skill set honed over decades of necessity, far surpassing the brute strength of his genetically improved foes. Blade finally breached the primary control room. There, he found not the elders themselves, they were too cautious for frontline duty, but the lead human geneticist, Dr. Eris Thorne, protected by two remaining senior council members. Thorne, pale and trembling, was trying to initiate a final data purge. The elders, realizing their folly, attempted to stop Thorne, fearing the loss of their research more than Blade's intervention. This created a fleeting moment of chaos, vampires fighting each other amidst human panic. Blade prioritized the termination of the protocol. He bypassed the elders entirely, slamming Thorne against a control panel, forcing the scientist to halt the purge sequence. With the data secured, a complete record of the genetic harvesting and the initial synthesized counteragents, Blade turned his attention to the elders. Their arrogance had returned, fueled by the knowledge that they still controlled vast resources. One elder attempted a direct mental assault, a standard vampire dominance technique, but Blade's hybrid nature acted as a disruptive insulator. The mental static merely bounced off his resolve. Blade executed them swiftly, cleanly, utilizing UV rounds that burst on impact with focused, lethal precision, vaporizing their corrupted forms. As the facility alarms began to blare, NISA's network now fully alerted to the breach, Blade uploaded the damning evidence of the Council's continued manipulation and illegal human experimentation to multiple anonymous global servers, ensuring the data would surface if he failed to escape. He looked at the preserved human subjects, now safe but deeply traumatized. He couldn't save them all, but he could ensure their suffering wasn't used as a weapon. He executed the system override to unlock their pods, setting them free into the facility's lower maintenance tunnels, hoping they could find their way out before the cleanup crews arrived. The mission was complete, the immediate threat neutralized, but the pervasive sense of weariness remained. He vanished into the ventilation shafts, moments before NISA's prearranged extraction team, a contingent of pragmatic, newly empowered vampires who favored her leadership, arrived to sanitize the scene, leaving Blade to melt back into the global anonymity he both despised and required. The game hadn't ended. It had simply entered a more complex, politically volatile phase. The data dump, a tactical weapon deployed by Blade across the digital underbelly of the world, served its purpose. It introduced chaos and fractured the remaining vestiges of the Council's authority. As Blade retreated from Geneva, the sheer effort of maintaining his disguise and fighting technologically augmented vampires left him physically drained, a sensation rarely experienced by the half-breed. He needed isolation to recover, to let the residual psychic residue of the facility, the desperation, the sterile horror, burn off his system. He journeyed east, seeking the quiet anonymity of the harsh Siberian tundra, a place where the vampire presence was sparse and the darkness felt ancient and elemental rather than engineered. NISA, having successfully leveraged the Geneva data to consolidate her own power base amongst the surviving moderate factions, was playing a dangerous political game. She was purging the hardline elders who had initiated the Ascension Protocol, framing them as reckless extremists whose actions had endangered all vampires. She presented herself as the necessary reformer, the vampire who understood that secrecy, when maintained through such brutal and high-profile actions, was unsustainable. She was rapidly becoming the de facto leader of a reformed, yet equally secretive vampire society. Yet, her pragmatism was a tightrope walk. She constantly looked over her shoulder, knowing Blade possessed the ultimate veto power, the ability to expose everything. Her interactions with him became less about collaboration and more about carefully worded warnings, ensuring his continued focus remained outward, on external threats, rather than inward, on her restructuring efforts. She admired his efficiency, yes, but she feared his morality, recognizing that his brand of justice was terminal for her kind. Blade, while recuperating, delved into the captured data. The genetic markers the Council had harvested were incredibly specific, pointing toward a rare, naturally occurring human resistance factor that could potentially neutralize synthesized vampire venom, the basis of the Reaper's initial weakness, and the potential basis for a weapon against any future mutation. This confirmed his greatest fear. The vampires, when cornered, always sought to turn humanity's strengths against itself. He realized the threat wasn't just about who ruled the shadows, but about the constant exploitation of the light. His training, initially fueled by visceral anger, was refining into a colder, more strategic calculus. He began to integrate subtle biological countermeasures into his own gear, testing how his unique hybrid blood might react to highly concentrated doses of the synthesized neutralizing agents recovered from Geneva. It was a dangerous self-experimentation, a blurring of the lines he normally maintained so fiercely, but the new threats demanded a deeper understanding of biochemistry. During this self-imposed exile, Blade experienced flashes of deeper connection to his past. The cold clarity of the tundra mirrored the emotional landscape of his mother's sacrifice. He found himself dwelling less on the act of killing and more on the possibility of eradication, a systemic solution, rather than merely managing flare-ups. This internal shift was slow, almost imperceptible, yet profound. It suggested a man tired of perpetual war, finally seeking a definitive, if likely unattainable, end. He understood that while Nisa sought to manage the vampire problem, he was perpetually driven toward solving it. And solving it meant that eventually, the reformed society she was building would also have to face his judgment, for the very nature of vampirism, in his eyes, remained the ultimate contaminant. He sharpened his blades against the frozen stone, waiting for the next inevitable sign that the equilibrium he'd violently enforced was already tipping again. The stillness was temporary. The shadow world always demanded a reckoning. The arrival of Blade 2 in 2002 marked a significant shift in the narrative trajectory established by the original cult hit, moving from a gritty, street-level supernatural thriller into something far more bombastic and visually driven, largely thanks to the directorial hand of Guillermo del Toro. This transition is immediately apparent in the film's expanded scope and the introduction of more intricate vampire mythology, moving beyond the simple human vs. Reaper dynamic. Wesley Snipes returns as Eric Brooks, the Daywalker, whose very existence remains a fascinating study in duality. Snipes, already deeply associated with the role following the success of the first film and his established persona as an action star capable of delivering dry, charismatic menace, embodies the perpetual isolation of a man caught between two worlds. His training and discipline, hinted at in the first film, are now fully on display, showcasing a kinetic physicality that remains one of the franchise's greatest assets. Del Toro leverages this capability, allowing Blade's combat sequences to evolve from mere brawls into complex, almost balletic displays of martial arts expertise mixed with heavy ordnance. The central conflict pivots around the emergence of the Reapers, a mutated strain of vampires whose existence threatens both human and traditional vampire societies. This introduction serves a dual purpose. It raises the stakes to near-apocalyptic levels, and, perhaps more importantly, it necessitates an uneasy alliance. This alliance brings back Whistler, played by Kris Kristofferson, whose grizzled, cynical paternalism provides necessary grounding against Blade's stoicism. Kristofferson's career, spanning decades of counterculture involvement and musical storytelling, lends an authenticity to the role of the world-weary mentor. The introduction of the Blood Pack, an elite squad of specialized vampire hunters, further complicates the moral landscape. Their leader, Scud, played by Norman Reedus before his breakout role in The Walking Dead, injects a necessary measure of jittery intelligence, and ultimately serves as a potent narrative catalyst for betrayal. Del Toro, whose cinematic language is often steeped in body horror and the grotesque, finds fertile ground here. The Reapers themselves are brilliant pieces of creature design, a physical manifestation of unchecked vampiric evolution, shedding the aristocratic elegance often associated with traditional vampires for something primal and insectile. This aesthetic choice aligns perfectly with Del Toro's fascination with monstrous beauty and biological extremity, echoing motifs seen later in films like Hellboy and Pan's Labyrinth. The narrative structure leans heavily on the unlikely partnership trope, most notably through Nyssa Damaskinos, played by Leonor Varela. As the daughter of the ancient vampire patriarch Eli Damaskinos, Nyssa represents the sliver of nobility within the old guard, forced to reckon with the evolutionary dead end her species faces. The interplay between Blade and Nyssa is intentionally charged, weaving in elements of romantic tension that feel earned, despite Blade's characteristic emotional unavailability. It suggests a path toward connection that the narrative ultimately denies him, reinforcing his tragic destiny as the eternal outsider. Technically, Blade the Sao is slicker and more expensive than its predecessor. The action sequences are crisper, utilizing more elaborate sets, particularly the subterranean vampire headquarters, which becomes a stunning showcase for Del Toro's penchant for Gothic architecture, infused with modern menace. The film leans into the operatic violence that defined the early 2000s comic book movie boom, yet manages to maintain a thematic focus on prejudice, the inherent inability of the two species, human hunters and established vampires, to overcome millennia of mistrust, even when facing mutual annihilation. However, the film occasionally struggles under the weight of its own spectacle. While the expansion of the mythology is intriguing, certain plot machinations, particularly the intricacies surrounding the true nature of the Damaskinos line, feel slightly over-engineered compared to the straightforward vengeance quest of the first installment. Nonetheless, Blade the Two stands as a high watermark for the character, largely due to Del Toro's unmistakable visual signature filtering the established lore through a lens of darkly beautiful, mutated horror. It remains a compelling piece of action cinema that successfully elevated its protagonist from cult favorite to blockbuster powerhouse. The sustained emotional core of Blade 2 rests precisely on Snipes' performance, which is less about dialogue and more about posture and reaction. His Blade is a machine meticulously maintained, yet the script occasionally allows glimpses of the cost of that maintenance. A brief flicker of exhaustion after a particularly brutal encounter, or the almost imperceptible softening of his gaze when interacting with Whistler. This performance is deeply physical. Every punch thrown, every stake driven, conveys not just effectiveness, but a deep, ingrained necessity. For Snipes, known for his disciplined approach to fight choreography, this role allowed him to merge his screen presence with high-octane discipline, resulting in a character who is terrifyingly competent but perpetually lonely. The introduction of the Reapers fundamentally alters the emotional stakes because they represent existential entropy. They are not merely better killers, they are an evolutionary mistake that consumes everything, erasing the possibility of coexistence or even conventional warfare. This forces the humans, represented by the pragmatic but ultimately flawed Blood Pack, to confront their limitations. Scud, the technician who bridges the gap between analog hunter and digital warfare, initially exudes an almost manic energy, eager to prove his worth to the legend Blade. Reedus plays this eagerness with a sharp, almost nervous energy that contrasts starkly with Blade's practiced calm, making the eventual revelation of his vulnerability, or perhaps his ambition. All the more jarring when the betrayal occurs. Del Toro's contribution is most vividly felt in the sensory experience of the film. The sound design alone deserves mention. The wet, tearing sound of a reaper feeding, or the heavy, rhythmic clang of Blade's boots in the echoing darkness of the Damaskinos' lair, elevates the horror quotient significantly. Where the first film felt like noir infused with action, Blade 2 borders on gothic opera. The vampires themselves, especially the elder Damaskinos, carry a theatrical weight. Eli Damaskinos, the ancient patriarch, embodies the weary arrogance of a dying ruling class, clinging to ancient protocols even as their species faces extinction. Varella's Nyssa carries the weight of this legacy, portraying a character caught between filial duty and survival instinct, making her eventual alignment with Blade feel like a pragmatic necessity rather than a passionate choice. Her moments with Blade are fraught with unspoken tension. He is the monster hunter. She is the privileged monster. A dynamic ripe for subtextual commentary on class and inherited guilt. The film's greatest emotional resonance, perhaps ironically, comes from the unwavering loyalty of Whistler. Kristofferson plays the mentor not as a wise sage, but as a battle-hardened cynic who has seen too much to believe in easy victories. His return, post-resurrection and transformation in the first film's aftermath, serves as a vital tether to Blade's humanity. Whistler is the only person allowed to call Blade by his given name without immediate consequence, and their shared scenes, often involving technical briefings or shared drinks in grimy safehouses, provide the few moments where Blade drops his guard, revealing the man beneath the leather and the vengeance. While the climax descends into spectacular creature-feature mayhem, the narrative threads concerning trust are what give the action weight. Every member of the Blood Pack, every temporary ally, exists under the shadow of potential mutation or betrayal. This pervasive atmosphere of suspicion is the emotional residue carried over from the first film, amplified here by the sheer biological danger posed by the Reapers. Blade 2 succeeds because it understands that the spectacle of fighting monsters is only compelling when those monsters threaten to undo the few fragile connections the hero has managed to forge in his endless war. The visual language Del Toro employs to delineate the hierarchy and danger within the vampire world is masterful. The Damaskinos compound itself is not merely a lavish lair, but a baroque prison, dripping with implied history and surveillance. This architecture mirrors the suffocating nature of the vampire aristocracy, suggesting that even their supposed sanctuaries are elaborate traps. Contrast this with the environments Blade inhabits: bleak warehouses, rain-slicked alleys, which symbolize his own existence. Functional, solitary, and always temporary. Snipes' costuming remains iconic, the reinforced leather serving as both armor and a second skin, emphasizing that Blade has deliberately shed any sense of comfortable normalcy. The way he moves in that attire, fluid yet utterly rigid in his purpose, suggests a man who has weaponized his own trauma. The emotional core deepens when considering the film's handling of physical transformation. The Reapers are not simply infected vampires. They are a perverse, accelerated natural selection, their mutation visceral and repulsive. This forces the audience to engage with a level of body horror that transcends the slick, stylized kills of the first movie. Del Toro excels at showing the agony of becoming something inhuman, and even the brief flashes of Reapers regaining some semblance of tactical awareness before fully succumbing to their bloodlust are chilling. This biological imperative acts as a dark mirror to Blade himself, a man created by a horrific biological event, perpetually fighting the urge to fully embrace the darkness that grants him power. The dynamic between Blade and Nyssa is deliberately engineered to explore the possibility of shared identity, a concept foreign to Eric Brooks. Varela imbues Nyssa with a quiet intelligence and a palpable sense of displacement. She is alienated from her father's tyranny and from the human world she cannot truly enter. Her vulnerability is not weakness, but a byproduct of her inherent morality, which sets her apart from the monstrous pragmatism of her lineage. Their mutual reliance in the trenches of combat creates moments where the leather jacket and the antique lace momentarily fade, replaced by two survivors recognizing a shared, cursed existence. Yet, the inherent tragedy is that Blade cannot afford intimacy. His mission demands absolute solitude, ensuring that any such connection must remain fractured or incomplete. Whistler functions as the necessary emotional anchor, the surrogate family Blade both craves and fears losing. Kristofferson's weary delivery, often laced with dark humor, serves to deflate Blade's often self-serious intensity. When Whistler expresses concern or offers gruff encouragement, it carries the weight of a lifetime of shared struggle, grounding the supernatural conflict in relatable human stakes. The fear of losing a friend, the desire to protect a surrogate son. This bond makes the subsequent near-fatal confrontations with the Blood Pack and the Reapers carry more than just action movie consequences. They threaten the integrity of Blade's only functional relationship. Ultimately, Blade the Sioux is a study in controlled escalation. It takes the premise of a marginalized hero fighting an unseen war and blows the scale up without entirely sacrificing the intimacy of the first film. The film's success lies in its ability to balance Del Toro's signature, richly detailed, and often gruesome creature features, with Snipes' singular, stoic intensity, creating a sequel that is both a superior action vehicle and a darker, more complex exploration of hybrid identity and necessary alliances in the face of evolutionary terror. The evolution of the antagonists, from the organized yet predictable threat of the flock in the first film to the biologically unhinged Reapers, signals a thematic pivot. The enemy is no longer merely organized evil, but chaos itself. The Reapers, having evolved past the need for subtlety or cunning, represent the terminal stage of the vampiric condition, a purity of appetite untainted by human pretense or social structure. This forces Blade, who meticulously controls his own partial vampirism, into a position where he must ally with the remnants of a corrupt system, the Damaskinos clan, to fight an anarchic biological threat. This alliance underscores a recurring theme in dark hero narratives. Sometimes the lesser evil, or the devil you know, must be temporarily embraced for survival. Scud's betrayal, while narratively convenient for injecting a late-stage twist, serves a more profound purpose in dissecting the fragile nature of trust within this specialized circle. His decision to side with the ultimate power, the promise of survival offered by the Reapers, or perhaps his own resentment toward the legendary Blade, highlights the corrosive effect of fear on human resolve. Reedus plays Scud's transition with a brittle intensity, suggesting a character who always felt subordinate to the myth of Blade and Whistler and sought power elsewhere. This mirrors the internal struggles Blade constantly faces, the lure of unchecked power versus the discipline required to remain an effective hunter. When Scud's true allegiance is revealed, it is a personal blow to Whistler and a reaffirmation of Blade's solitary creed, that true trust is a luxury he cannot afford. Guillermo del Toro consistently utilizes practical effects and deeply integrated creature design to anchor the fantastical in the tangible, and Blade the Second is a masterclass in this. The Reapers, with their hinged jaws and unsettling speed, feel physically present in every frame they occupy. This tactile quality prevents the film from dissolving entirely into CGI spectacle. The practical physicality of the threats demands an equally grounded response from Snipes, whose fight choreography here is arguably the franchise peak. His ability to switch seamlessly from close-quarters grappling to utilizing environmental elements, like the sheer drop in the Damaskinos Tower, showcases a performance honed through years of demanding action roles. This physicality communicates that Blade is not just fighting monsters. He is constantly managing the fine line between his own control and primal rage. The final confrontation, an explosion of Baroque destruction within the ancient vampire stronghold, functions as a cleansing fire. It resolves the immediate threat, but leaves the primary emotional questions, Blade's isolation, his potential for connection, unanswered. Nyssa, having shed the toxicity of her family, becomes a symbol of the road Blade cannot take. Her survival suggests a future where the vampire species might evolve beyond its current violent cycle, but Blade remains tethered to his personal vendetta and his hybrid biology. The film concludes not with hope for Blade's peace, but with a renewed, weary commitment to the hunt, solidified by the survival of his partnership with Whistler, suggesting that for the Daywalker, existence is defined solely by the next dawn and the next enemy. The narrative's cyclical nature, concluding not in resolution but in recommitment, is fundamentally tied to the inherent tragedy of Eric Brooks's character arc. His relentless pursuit is less a quest for victory and more a definition of self. If the hunting stops, the duality defining him, the human heart fighting the vampire craving, threatens to consume him entirely. Snipes perfectly externalizes this internal struggle through his disciplined gait. The slow, deliberate movements in moments of quiet contrast sharply with the explosive efficiency of combat, suggesting constant energetic containment. This economy of expression prevents Blade from ever becoming purely heroic. He remains a damaged instrument, functional only within the context of violence. The environmental storytelling employed by Del Toro further reinforces this theme of inherited corruption versus necessary purity. The sterile modern elements of the Blood Pack's equipment, juxtaposed against the crumbling, almost ecclesiastical grandeur of the Damaskinos' estate, suggest a conflict between pragmatic survivalism and decaying tradition. The vampires clinging to their ancient rituals are ultimately outmaneuvered by a superior biological design, the Reapers, and the sheer brute force application of modern weaponry guided by Blade's singular focus. This speaks volumes about the obsolescence of old-world power structures when faced with emergent, pure threat, a theme often explored in Del Toro's work when examining entrenched authority figures. Nyssa's role extends beyond that of a romantic foil. She embodies the possibility of a viable, less predatory future for her kind. Her willingness to destroy her father and the established order demonstrates a moral clarity that Blade, perpetually focused on the immediate enemy, often lacks. In their brief moments of collaboration, there is a silent recognition. They are both biological anomalies fighting systems built upon rigid definitions. However, Blade's inherent inability to trust or integrate makes her departure at the film's close feel inevitable. She represents an opportunity for systemic change, whereas Blade is destined for perpetual systemic opposition. Kris Kristofferson's Whistler remains the essential conduit to Blade's suppressed humanity. His relationship with Blade is characterized by a protective cynicism. He sees the monster Blade is fighting, and perhaps the monster Blade could become, and counters it with abrasive affection. The emotional weight of their survival is demonstrated in the small details. The shared glance after a narrow escape, the simple act of sharing space without immediate hostility. Whistler is the living proof that Blade has fought hard enough not just to survive, but to maintain a connection, however strained. When they ride off into the neon-lit morning haze at the film's conclusion, it is not a celebration of victory, but a shared acknowledgement of endurance, the quiet understanding that the cycle of violence begins again at sundown. Blade 2 solidifies the hero's mythology not by offering him redemption, but by demonstrating the immense fortitude required to maintain his unique, necessary purgatory. The sustained tension throughout Blade 2 is derived from the constant negotiation of identity, both for the protagonist and the monsters he hunts. The Reapers are perhaps the most potent representation of this theme, existing as the ultimate rejection of the measured, nuanced existence that Blade strives for. They are pure id, biological imperatives unleashed, serving as a terrifying visualization of what Blade might become if he ever allowed his own inherent vampiric qualities to fully surface. This internal threat, the potential for the Daywalker to degrade into the very thing he despises, is what elevates the stakes beyond simple physical confrontation. It is a battle for spiritual survival. Snipes' performance consistently communicates this tightrope walk. The moments of extreme exertion in combat are not just displays of strength, but of immense, focused willpower, suppressing the underlying monstrousness. The film's aesthetic choices powerfully underline this contrast between the refined and the feral. Del Toro's penchant for mixing high culture settings, the elaborate, almost cathedral-like vampire headquarters, with scenes of visceral degradation, creates a richly textured world. The vampires of the Damaskinos line are obsessed with preservation, hierarchy, and image, yet they are entirely blindsided by the primal, evolutionary leap represented by the Reapers. This highlights the fatal flaw of arrogance rooted in tradition. Eli Damaskinos, played with a chilly grandeur, views Blade as an amusing aberration, failing to grasp that adaptation, not stagnation, is the key to survival. Leonor Varela's Nisa, by contrast, embodies the flicker of intelligent, pragmatic adaptation necessary to move forward, even if it means patricide. The emotional temperature in scenes involving Whistler is deliberately kept low and familiar, serving as a crucial counterpoint to the operatic drama surrounding the vampires. Kristofferson's weary presence grounds the entire enterprise. He is the audience surrogate who understands the cost of this lifestyle better than anyone else. When Whistler cracks a sardonic joke while patching up Blade, it's an act of defiance against the bleakness of their reality. It reaffirms their bond as a self-made family unit operating outside societal norms, providing Blade with the only safe harbor in his existence. The near loss of Whistler, or the threat of his mutation, carries far greater emotional weight than any of the grand declarations of the vampire elders. Furthermore, the introduction and subsequent explosive demise of the Blood Pack serve as a cautionary tale regarding hubris and the limitations of specialized expertise divorced from moral grounding. Scud, the eager technician, represents ambition corrupted by proximity to legendary power. His betrayal is less about malice and more about a desire to control the narrative, to move from observer to participant in the power structure. Norman Reedus imbues Scud with an almost tragic yearning for importance, which makes his transformation, and the necessary, ruthless termination by Blade, feel like a grim necessity rather than a mere plot point. It reinforces Blade's core belief: reliance on external, untested factors leads only to catastrophe. In essence, Blade Due 2 functions as a perfectly calibrated second act. It deepens the character mythology through spectacular action, while simultaneously exploring the claustrophobic nature of Blade's necessary isolation. The film's conclusion leaves the hero exactly where he needs to be for the ongoing narrative. Alive, slightly more scarred, his solitary purpose reaffirmed, riding toward the next inevitable confrontation, his only companion the man who constantly reminds him of the humanity he fights so hard to preserve. The film never promises Blade a release from the hunt, only the means to endure it with the right and highly selective company. The thematic exploration of heritage and forced evolution in Blade 2 provides a richer tapestry than the straightforward good versus evil narrative of the original. Blade himself is the supreme hybrid, a product of an unwilling biological merger, and the film examines those who embrace or reject their monstrous lineage. The Damaskinos clan represents a failed attempt at controlled evolution. They seek immortality through sophisticated, contained means, ultimately proving themselves too rigid and decadent to adapt to the sheer biological imperative of the Reapers. This contrast, the ancient vampire society clinging to velvet ropes and old-world political maneuvering versus the primal, viral spread of the Reapers, serves as a potent metaphor for obsolescence. Del Toro revels in this visual dichotomy, showing the polished, gothic interiors ruined by the wet, chaotic destruction wrought by the mutants, effectively symbolizing the triumph of raw, unstoppable nature over stifling artificial order. Wesley Snipes' mastery of the Daywalker persona is most evident in his restraint. In the original, Blade was defined by reaction. Here, he is defined by proactive, disciplined force. His movements are economical, conveying a sense that every expenditure of energy must serve a critical purpose, a necessity born from fighting an enemy that reproduces exponentially. The rare moments where Blade shows any semblance of vulnerability, often witnessed only by Whistler or fleetingly by Nyssa, are carefully calibrated payoffs. These moments are not character development in the traditional sense, but rather glimpses behind the emotional armor, proving that the man underneath the leather is still operating on borrowed time and willpower. Snipes carries the weight of this immense internal policing, making his physical competence seem like a necessary, exhausting form of self-medication against the darkness within. The role of Nyssa, viewed through the lens of career trajectory, provided Leonor Varela with a complex, powerful female lead outside the typical damsel trope. She is both participant and revolutionary within her own world. Her alliance with Blade is born not of romance, but of shared existential threat and a pragmatic understanding of necessary brutality. She demonstrates the capacity for self-sacrifice and the rejection of inherited sin that Blade himself can never truly experience, as his identity is so deeply intertwined with vengeance. Her character arc suggests that change in the vampire world is possible, but it must be radical and destructive, echoing the themes of necessary revolution present in many of Del Toro's narratives where the established order must be violently swept away. Whistler's unwavering presence is the film's crucial emotional anchor, the only consistent element of normalcy in Blade's chaotic existence. Kris Kristofferson's performance radiates a gruff, deeply felt paternal concern that acts as a counterweight to Blade's emotional austerity. Whistler understands that their war is not winnable in the conventional sense. It is a state of perpetual engagement. Their conversations, sparse and often laden with dry wit, are vital because they are the only instances where Blade is treated as an individual rather than a weapon. This relationship underscores the theme that even the most isolated warrior requires a connection, however strained, to avoid complete dehumanization by the very darkness they confront. The quiet understanding between them as they prepare for the next hunt reaffirms that the personal stakes, loyalty and friendship, are what truly drive Blade's ceaseless crusade, far more than abstract concepts of human safety. The thematic resonance of Blade 2 is deeply embedded in its creature design, which serves as a visual commentary on unchecked biological drive versus controlled monstrosity. The Reapers, with their gaping secondary jaws and insectile movements, embody a kind of evolutionary purity stripped of all culture or pretense. They are simply hunger given form. This contrasts sharply with the highly stylized, aristocratic vampires represented by the Damaskinos family. Del Toro utilizes this visual opposition to suggest that civilization, even when monstrous, is inherently weaker than pure, adaptable instinct when survival is the only metric. Blade, caught between these two poles, represents the failed synthesis, a being capable of controlling his instinct, yet perpetually defined by the biological accident that created him. Snipes maintains this tension through his physicality. His movements are fluid when necessary, but always encased in a rigid framework of control, suggesting an immense effort is constantly being expended to keep the internal beast leashed. The narrative structure deliberately employs betrayal to test the limits of trust, particularly concerning Scud. Norman Reedus portrays Scud not as a master manipulator, but as an insecure technician desperate for validation from figures larger than life, Blade and Whistler. His turn against his allies is motivated by the allure of belonging to the dominant power, whether that be the ancient vampire hierarchy or the immediate terrifying strength of the Reapers. This human frailty, symbolized by Scud's inability to withstand the pressure, serves as a direct challenge to Blade's operating philosophy, which is rooted in absolute self-reliance. When Scud is dispatched, it's a confirmation for Blade that vulnerability breeds catastrophe, hardening his already formidable emotional defenses. Leonor Varela's Nisa is crucial in offering an alternative perspective on vampirism. Unlike the typical antagonist's offspring, Nisa displays genuine moral repulsion toward her father's stagnation and the horror of the Reapers. Her alliance with Blade is utilitarian, built on mutual necessity, yet it allows for moments of genuine, albeit fraught, human interaction. Varela plays Nisa with a restrained nobility that suggests she carries the burden of a history she never chose, mirroring Blade's own curse. Their dynamic is compelling because it explores the possibility of shared existential dread without ever fully resolving into conventional romance, respecting Blade's established narrative isolation. She is the only one who sees the necessity of her father's destruction, aligning her with Blade's methodology, even if their ultimate goals for the future differ. Finally, the relationship between Blade and Whistler remains the bedrock of the film's emotional accessibility. Kris Kristofferson's performance as the world-weary mentor is indispensable. He provides the necessary cynical humor and genuine care that humanizes the Daywalker. Whistler's scars, both visible and implied from his previous ordeal, are badges of honor in their shared grim reality. He functions as Blade's confessor and quartermaster, the keeper of his history, and the reminder of his connection to the human side of the conflict. Their partnership is characterized by unspoken contracts and mutual protection, suggesting that Blade's crusade is sustained not by a grand mission to save humanity, but by a fierce, personal loyalty to the one person who treats him as a flawed man rather than an apex predator. The final shot of them disappearing into the urban sprawl confirms their fate. Perpetual war, sustained only by their unwavering, if unconventional, camaraderie. The tactical execution of the vampire eradication in Blade 2 showcases a deliberate escalation in the franchise's commitment to spectacle, driven by Guillermo del Toro's distinct visual flair. The introduction of specialized weaponry and equipment for the Blood Pack, which includes everything from explosive rounds to advanced surveillance gear, creates a temporary illusion of parity against the ancient vampire threat. However, the film masterfully uses this brief period of technological confidence to underscore the essential difference between human preparedness and the inherent biological superiority of the supernatural foe. The hunters believe they can analyze and catalog the threat, mirroring the flawed hubris that characterized previous generations of vampire slayers, a hubris the Reapers instantly shatter with their speed and virulence. Wesley Snipes' portrayal of Blade is defined by his absolute lack of extraneous movement. In a film saturated with elaborate creature effects and frenetic action, Blade remains the still, dark center of the storm. This stoicism is not apathy. It is supreme concentration. When facing the Reapers, whose attacks are almost instantaneous, Blade's reflexes appear superhuman because they must be faster than the enemy's evolved biology. His reliance on his signature twin swords and firearms against creatures that move in blurs emphasizes his mastery over different modes of combat, the precise martial art versus the brute force necessary for biological termination. This constant internal negotiation, how much vampire power to use without losing himself, is etched into the tautness of Snipes' physical performance. The film's emotional texture is enriched by the fragile solidarity forged between Blade and Nisa. Leonor Varela brings a regal yet desperate quality to the vampire heiress, making her a protagonist in her own right, seeking liberation from a dying dynasty. Their partnership is fundamentally utilitarian, stripped of the romantic gloss often imposed on such pairings. They recognize each other as necessary evils and highly effective operatives. Nisa's willingness to execute her own father demonstrates a pragmatic ruthlessness that Blade respects, a recognition that tradition must be sacrificed for survival. This shared moment of necessary patricide links them thematically, suggesting that true evolution often requires destroying the past, a concept central to Del Toro's fascination with monstrous rebirth. Kris Kristofferson's Whistler provides the vital, albeit world-weary heart of the story. He is the voice of lived experience, the constant source of dry commentary that prevents the film from collapsing entirely under its own gothic weight. His affection for Blade is paternal and protective, rooted in the shared trauma of the first film. Whistler's presence ensures that Blade's war is not just a philosophical battle against the undead, but a personal struggle to maintain the few connections that validate his ongoing existence. Their easy banter during downtime, however brief, acts as an emotional pressure release valve, signifying that the relationship is the only truly stable covenant in Blade's life, a covenant the narrative tests severely through the machinations of Scud and the pervasive danger. The survival of this bond is the only acceptable victory for the Daywalker. The commitment to practical tactile horror in Blade 2 ensured that even amidst the heightened spectacle, the visceral reality of the conflict remained paramount. Del Toro's insistence on showcasing the Reapers through elaborate prosthetic work rather than relying solely on digital rendering gave their rampages a disturbing, almost clumsy weight. They are creatures of base appetite, and their design, the hinged mouths, the raw musculature, speaks directly to a horror of biology unbound by restraint. This visceral reality forces Blade, the controlled hybrid, into a state of amplified alertness. Snipes' performance becomes less about cool detachment and more about the intense concentration required to engage with a threat whose every movement is predicated on pure, unthinking destruction. The Daywalker's grace in combat is thus redefined. It is not just skill, but a disciplined act of suppressing his own latent biological chaos to counter a worse manifestation of it. The relationship between Blade and Whistler continues to function as the essential humanizing agent in a narrative increasingly populated by monstrous forms. Kristofferson's Whistler is the embodiment of earned cynicism. His dark humor is a shield against the despair inherent in their mission. He is the only character privileged enough to challenge Blade without fear of immediate reprisal, often through pointed, fatherly exasperation. This dynamic suggests that Blade's motivation isn't a grand quest for human salvation, but a highly personalized commitment to the few people who have proven themselves trustworthy. The shared moments of repair and strategizing are quiet acts of intimacy in a world that constantly demands explosive violence, underscoring that for Blade, survival is meaningful only insofar as it preserves these fragile, chosen bonds. Nisa Damaskinos serves as a necessary foil, representing a path of evolution that Blade cannot take. Leonor Varela portrays her with a compelling mixture of aristocratic bearing and pragmatic resolve. She is a product of ancient power, yet possesses the necessary moral clarity to sever ties with her decadent ancestry. Her decision to align with Blade is less romantic and more an acknowledgement of shared destiny as evolutionary outliers. She understands that clinging to the past, as her father does, leads to extinction, a lesson she enforces with lethal finality. This mirrors Blade's own constant need to discard the remnants of his human past, the need to kill those who threaten his mission, to maintain his effectiveness. The tension between them is built on mutual competence under duress, highlighting that connection, for Blade, must be forged in the fire of mutual combat rather than softer social interactions. Scud's betrayal offers a sharp, painful commentary on the corruption of aspiration. Norman Reedus's jittery, ambitious technician embodies the flaw of trying to integrate into a world of legend without having earned the requisite discipline. He seeks the power associated with Blade, not the burden. His fall serves as a brutal demonstration of the isolation Blade consciously maintains. Proximity to the fight does not confer understanding or loyalty, and reliance on untested operatives is a guaranteed path to disaster. The swift, brutal removal of Scud reinforces the film's underlying bleakness. In the world of the Daywalker, sentimentality and unchecked ambition are liabilities that lead only to mutation or death, leaving Blade and Whistler to ride on, perpetually poised for the next Twilight confrontation. The narrative cohesion of Blade 2 is sustained by its unflinching commitment to the protagonist's inherent solitude. even when circumstances force temporary alliance. Wesley Snipes' performance continues to communicate that Blade is a functional entity only when unburdened by emotional reliance. His famous monotone delivery is not merely a stylistic choice, but the sonic manifestation of a man who has systematically pruned away anything that could be used as leverage against him. The physical vocabulary, the way he occupies space with a predatory stillness, suggests a constant state of readiness, a perpetual high alert necessitated by his hybrid nature. The action sequences, choreographed with meticulous kineticism, function as catharsis for the internal battle he wages. Every successful dismemberment of a Reaper is a temporary victory over the very biological potential lurking within himself. Guillermo del Toro's vision elevates the environment to an active participant in the conflict. The claustrophobic, ornate dungeons of the Damaskinos' lair are less a stronghold and more an elaborate tomb designed by the arrogant dead. This gothic excess is violently interrupted by the Reapers, whose emergence represents a horrifying biological democratization. They are the anti-aristocrats, unconcerned with legacy or elegance, driven solely by an accelerated savage hunger. This environmental contrast underscores the thematic message. Stagnation, even gilded stagnation, cannot withstand pure, adaptive chaos. Del Toro uses light and shadow to emphasize this, plunging the sterile, modern elements into the ancient darkness where the true battle for survival plays out. The brief, strained partnership with Nisa Damaskinos provides necessary narrative friction. Leonor Varela portrays Nisa not as a love interest waiting to be rescued, but as a politically astute operator recognizing the failure of her lineage. Her pragmatic approach to eliminating her own father is a mirror to Blade's own necessary ruthlessness. However, the crucial difference remains. Nisa seeks to reform or survive within a world, whereas Blade is doomed to perpetually stand outside it. Their connection is defined by professional respect forged under fire, a fleeting recognition of two beings fundamentally alienated from their respective worlds. The ending sees Blade unable to accept the path of reformation she offers, reinforcing that his destiny is defined by the hunt itself, not the goal of peace. The emotional anchor Whistler, played by Kris Kristofferson, is the film's most potent defense against narrative nihilism. His grizzled sarcasm and unwavering presence serve as the only permissible form of intimacy for Blade. Whistler's continued survival, post-resurrection, symbolizes a successful fight against absolute corruption. He understands the cost of every stake and bullet, offering a grounded human perspective that keeps Blade's actions tethered to something tangible beyond mere vengeance. When Whistler offers gruff encouragement or demands adherence to procedure, it signifies that the partnership itself is the mission. Their departure at the end, heading into the uncertain dawn, is not triumphant, but deeply personal, a shared acknowledgement that they have survived another night, and that fragile human connection is the only armor against the encroaching darkness. Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Q-Man channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Blade 2 from 2002. The Shadow World, a realm where the nocturnal hunt is not merely a metaphor but a stark reality, calls back its most infamous operative. Wesley Snipes, embodying Blade, the half-human, half-vampire hybrid. Having spent time honing his skills against the blood-sucking menace across various dimly lit corners of the globe, a tireless vigil inherited from his mother's tragic encounter with a vampire's bite, Blade finds himself reluctantly drawn back into the fray. This time, the threat is not the usual rabble of the undead, but something far more alarming, a plague threatening even the established hierarchy of the vampire nation. The Council of Elders, those ancient, usually complacent bloodsuckers, who prefer their existence discreetly hidden in opulent subterranean lairs, summon him. They recognize a superior existential danger when they see one. The threat is a new breed of vampire, mutated and hyper-aggressive, dubbed the Reapers. Unlike their ancestors who operated under certain gentlemanly rules, avoiding wholesale slaughter to maintain secrecy. The Reapers are ravenous, fast, and seemingly unstoppable, devouring humans and vampires alike with terrifying efficiency. This new strain possesses a vulnerability Blade's usual arsenal might not easily counter, and its very existence threatens to expose the vampire secret to the wider, unsuspecting human world, a catastrophic outcome for the species as a whole. Blade, ever the solitary warrior whose commitment to extermination stems from personal tragedy rather than any sense of duty to the Council, agrees to cooperate, but on his own uncompromising terms. He is pragmatic. If the Reapers wipe out the vampires, they might just turn their attention to him next, or worse, to the human world he secretly protects. He brings his signature arsenal, the UV weaponry, the customized bikes, and the quiet, intimidating efficiency that has made him a legend in the underground circuits. His investigation leads him to Prague, a city steeped in ancient European Gothicism, the perfect backdrop for this escalating war. He needs assistance, and surprisingly, the Council provides it, though not without suspicion. Enter Nisa Damaskinos, played with a subtle, regal air, the daughter of Eli Damaskinos, the apparent progenitor of the current vampire society. She is intelligent, resourceful, and perhaps harbors a flicker of genuine desire to save her species, rather than just cling to outdated power structures. There is also a team of elite vampire assassins, the Shadow Squad, assigned to work alongside Blade, an arrangement fraught with mutual distrust. The core of the problem soon becomes apparent. The Reapers were engineered, accidentally or intentionally, in the labs of Eli Damaskinos himself, an attempt to breed a superior vampire free from the usual weaknesses. But science, like unchecked ambition, often breeds monstrosities. The lead Reaper, Quinn, is revealed to be one of Damaskinos' former creations, now turned leader of the new breed, embodying a brutal evolution of vampire physiology. Blade's methods clash violently with the Council's desire for subtlety. His raids are spectacular and destructive, demonstrating his utter lack of concern for collateral damage, human or vampire. As the investigation deepens, a personal connection to the conspiracy emerges. Blade encounters Scud, Damaskinos' seemingly meek lab assistant, who turns out to be deeply involved in the genetic tampering, driven by a perverse desire for recognition and perhaps a touch of envy for Blade's unique hybrid strength. The final confrontation takes place in Damaskinos' sprawling, heavily fortified headquarters. It becomes a chaotic three-way battle. Blade, attempting to eradicate the Reapers and expose the Council's complicity. The Reapers, hungry for blood and dominance, and the remaining Council forces fighting a desperate rearguard action. Nisa proves her worth, fighting alongside Blade with skill honed by generations of vampire privilege, recognizing that true survival means adaptation, not stagnation. In the climax, Blade faces off against Quinn, the monstrous Reaper leader. The fight is visceral, testing Blade's limits. The Reaper's speed and sheer power are overwhelming. Yet Blade's unique heritage, his relentless training, and his sheer willpower see him through. He eliminates the primary threat, ultimately confronting Damaskinos himself, exposing the arrogance that bred this disaster. Nisa, surviving the carnage, shows a newfound respect, perhaps even affection, for the vampire hunter, acknowledging the necessity of his brutal crusade. As dawn breaks over the bloodied halls, the immediate danger is neutralized. Blade, ever the phantom, slips away, leaving Nisa and the few survivors to deal with the wreckage. His mission is never truly complete. The shadows merely shift, and a tireless hunter must remain ever vigilant for the next iteration of darkness, a destiny sealed long before his birth. The atmosphere in Prague was thick, not just with the ancient chill of Eastern European stone, but with the palpable tension of an impending apocalypse filtered through Gothic architecture. Blade moved through it like a phantom forged in chrome and vengeance, his movements economical, betraying years spent perfecting the art of the silent kill. Snipes's portrayal always suggested a man perpetually running on low fuel, fueled only by pure, unadulterated rage against the night dwellers. He carried the weight of his existence, the constant proximity to the darkness he fought, in the hard set of his jaw and the way his trench coat seemed to absorb all available light. Nisa Damaskinos, conversely, exuded a practiced grace. She was a creature of privilege, who nonetheless possessed a keen, predatory intellect. Watching her interact with Blade was fascinating. She possessed the arrogance of someone accustomed to giving orders, yet she recognized in him a force of nature she couldn't command, only perhaps momentarily align with. Her initial interactions with him were laced with condescension, viewing his human-derived grit with suspicion, contrasting it sharply with the inherited immortality of her kind. Her lineage, descending from Damaskinos, meant she was deeply embedded in the culture of secrecy, a culture the Reapers were shattering with their reckless consumption. The introduction of the Shadow Squad was a masterstroke of dramatic irony. These elite vampires, honed by centuries of carefully managed violence, were tasked with protecting the hunter they secretly despised. Their leader, Whistler's stand-in perhaps in spirit if not in presence, treated Blade with barely concealed contempt. They saw his methods as messy, too overtly violent, a danger to the delicate veneer of their civilization. They adhered to the old rules that were now proving utterly insufficient against an enemy unbound by tradition. The deeper Blade delved into the engineering behind the Reapers, the more disgusted he became. Damaskinos, the patriarch, was revealed not just as an ancient vampire, but as a hubristic scientist, a veritable Dr. Frankenstein of the undead. The creation of the Reapers, dubbed the Death Dealers in some circles, was an attempt to transcend mortality's petty limitations, to create the ultimate predator. This reflected a common trope in cinematic villains, the pursuit of perfect evolution leading directly to catastrophic downfall. Damaskinos' laboratory, when finally explored, wasn't just a torture chamber. It was a gleaming, high-tech monument to ego, contrasting sharply with Blade's analog, brute-force approach. Scud, the seemingly harmless tech liaison, provided the human element of betrayal. His transformation from nervous underling to active participant in the Reaper genesis was subtly foreshadowed by his obsessive tinkering, his hunger for recognition overshadowing any inherent loyalty to the established hierarchy. He represented the dangerous allure of power, even if channeled through grotesque experimentation. The final battle was less about tactics and more about raw survival against overwhelming biological superiority. Quinn, the lead Reaper, was depicted as a terrifying physical specimen, muscles coiled, jaws elongated beyond human recognition, moving with a speed that defied physics. When Blade and Quinn clashed, it wasn't a duel of wits. It was a visceral slugfest where Blade had to rely on his unique physiology, the half-human resilience combined with vampire strength, to absorb punishment that would instantly kill any pureblood. The environment itself became weaponized. UV flares exploded in blinding sheets, turning the Baroque halls into abstract expressionist canvases of fire and shadow. Nissa, fighting side by side with the human-sided half-breed, finally shed the last vestiges of her aristocratic detachment, fighting with a desperate ferocity born of realizing her entire world was minutes from being devoured. When Blade finally dispatched Quinn, plunging a custom-made blade deep into his exposed heart, or whatever passed for it, it was less a victory celebration and more a temporary lull in an unending war. The escape into the pale morning light reaffirmed Blade's isolation. He could save the world, but he could never truly belong to it, or to the night he hunted.